Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me today is co-host Jay Body. Jay, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Chris. Glad to be here to join you again.
Yeah, it's great to have a guest come on as a co-host. I'm excited to have you here, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation and finding out more about the gas markets, which I think we're going to do today.
Yep, likewise. I'll take a moment with introducing myself. I've been on the previous episode of Insider's Guide to Energy with Chris, and we talked a little bit about the gas market in the U.S. and what's affecting it, and maybe just in the future, what are some of the tea leaves, discussing some of the topics that are affecting the natural gas markets. And I talked a little bit last time about this kind of this Germany moment that maybe the Northeast or the California market might experience this winter. And so it didn't happen in the Northeast, but a lot has happened this winter in the California market. And so we have an expert from the California market, Ken Gustafson, who we're going to talk a little bit about to shed some light and maybe provide his insight on this. So Ken, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, or good to see you guys, Chris and Jay. Ken Gustafson. So I am an energy trading and finance advisor. My background is 30 years plus of commodity trading in energy space, oil, natural gas, electricity, renewables, across the board for financial institutions and merchant energy traders like Shell, which I helped them build out their gas and power trading business in Houston, and then ultimately joined them for a stint. And then my last larger roles, I ran the commodity structuring for Citigroup's North American trading business, financial and physical, across power and natural gas. Recently, the last 4 years, I've been really focused as I'm a founding partner of Vide Advisors. So I work on the consulting and advisory side of our firm, which also has an accounting and insurance piece. But I really focus on clients around risk management, energy, and commodity. And that's where that's why I find myself here today.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. And with your background and what I know from our pre-conversation and what Jay just said is I think you're spending a little bit of time in the California market. And from what it looks like from the outside, there's a bit of volatility going on there. It's an interesting time there. What's going on in California these days? What's happening in the gas market in California?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll kind of precurse this. So we started seeing right around the Ukraine war last year. Obviously, we saw an elevated, the way the natural gas markets, it's all based on Henry Hub, Louisiana, which is the primary marker for natural gas. And then you have basis, basically differentiates your natural gas as it goes to different locations. As Jay mentioned, the Northeast is always typically a top location, the Midwest, and then you have the producing regions, and then the West. And we had elevated natural gas coming out of Henry right out of the Ukraine war with expectations of massive LNG shipments, which did happen. And you had a tight market. And as the summer progressed, though, very interestingly, and we had and I'm sure our audience is familiar with Freeport LNG, big liquefaction plant going out in the Gulf Coast. So a lot of volumes that they thought were going to be exported actually kind of dropped Henry Hub pricing. So that kind of came down in the market because now we were a little bit better supplied. Interesting, right? Okay, so traders feel a little more comfortable. The longs were not happy, but end users and utilities were fired up because okay, prices are not going to be so elevated. I'm going to take advantage of some lower pricing. And the West ended up being a super challenge. So right off the bat, from the kind of the Ukraine effects and what happened to basis, the way storage works is you've got to have basically there's two reasons you put gas into storage. You're mandated as a utility to put gas into storage in expectation for your winter season coming up. And two, there's a financial reward to do it. I could put my gas in inexpensively. I store it for a forward period, and I actually make a spread, less insurance and interest rate, and my marginal cost of doing so. Well, the curves were really flat, so there wasn't a lot of incentive in the West. There weren't a lot of incentives in the West to put gas into storage. So really, interestingly, the West was kind of behind this year. And then going into the season, so through June into July, and then you get a pretty warm July, August into September, and you really had some good power poles going into power generation. Okay,
That's
for
great.
power
So
generation.
right. So just picking up on that. So in the California market, what is it that's causing in the natural gas market this volatility? Is it just the fact that Californians just think fossil fuels are bad and they don't want it at any replacement cost whatsoever? That's kind of like A. And maybe the choice B is it just policymakers that might be something that they're not doing, or C, all of the above? What's your opinion?
Sure. It's kind of interesting, and that's why I was just trying to set the table a little bit with a storage situation. So what they were is they were already behind the curve with like, I haven't saved enough gas for the wintertime because I burned it in the summertime. Okay. So they struggled. And to your point on that situation, which looks a lot like the Northeast, where the Northeast actually imports LNG and competes in the Atlantic Basin with Europe for natural gas or LNG cargoes as peaking. There's not, the existing infrastructure into the West Coast is defined. You have a couple pipelines coming in from the Permian, Transwestern, and El Paso. You've got some pipeline infrastructure coming in from the Rockies, and then you've got stuff that drops down from Canada. But it's all that those pipes are done. They're done. They're really, there hasn't been any new infrastructure in years. So
So
in
just
that,
based on
yeah,
the Inflation Reduction Act and what's going on in the State of the Union that happened earlier this week, what's kind of the prognosis for the future of natural gas in California and then just in general in the U.S.? Are we seeing a more greening of the grid? Because I'm seeing in other parts of the world and even in New England, at the peak of the New England, it was actually they were burning oil. And
yes,
so the intended effect was the greening, but what actually in effect happened was the opposite. And same with California. They're retiring nuclear. They're trying to reduce gas, but in effect, what they end up doing is consuming more of it. So what's your take based on what policymakers are saying and what's going to happen for natural gas?
absolutely. So to your point, you've had a massive build out in renewables and wind, and part of that issue is, which like really jump started the summer, is you had less wind. Okay, so you had less wind generation than the utilities expected. You had strong demand for air conditioning load, and you pulled a lot of gas. So you basically had a policy decision a long time ago, right, to basically take out nuclear generation, take out mid-merit and natural gas generation, and focus on renewables and imports from other states that actually had a little bit more flexibility. And that's kind of been their dogma. If you look at Berkeley, you look at some of these other Oakland, you look at some of these other cities in California, they're actually banning natural gas appliances. They're banning new builds. They're banning natural gas furnaces and other heating and HVAC. So what you're seeing is that the notion there is, okay, we're not going to allow you to build any new infrastructure, but the way we're going to manage this is we're going to handle it by, okay, you just can't put in any more end-use appliances or end-use equipment that needs natural gas. We're going to force you off of natural gas, and that's kind of the situation they were in.
So the policy, the unintended consequence was, from what I heard Jay say, and I think you confirmed, is we'd like to get rid of the hydrocarbons, so we're not going to support that in policy. But in the demand cycle that we're in right now, that forces some bad choices, right? That's kind of the gist of what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're getting is you're getting these policy choices, and we all talk about the energy transition. Well, it just can't be done instantly. And what you're having happen are these supply and demand mismatches, which are absolutely the effect of policy and creating scarcity rents, if you want to call it really high prices or really low prices, to kind of trigger and manage the supply and demand differences.
And then how is that affecting in the market? So you're talking about the volatility in the market. Is the public would perceive that the energy companies are just getting greedy and making a lot of money. It's a market condition is what's driving the money go up and down, or the pricing going up and down. How is that going to play out? So this transition is planned to take place. We're seeing volatility, but how does that smooth out, and how do we get the transition to be successful if that's the policy's intent?
So that is a really interesting, I'll share, really what happened is, in November, December, and January. So in California, we all see in the news, we followed on social media, when they saw gasoline go $7 to $8 a gallon this past summer. Okay, you know that because you can see it. You're driving by the gas station, you see that price. Okay, I'm going to make another decision. I'm going to try to have a more circuitous route when I'm picking up my groceries and my laundry. I might, do different things to save money because I know what my gasoline prices are. This is a very opaque professional market. So when you had this massive rally and this constraint in natural gas, consumers kept on going on doing what they're doing. And the only difference is they were suffering in Southern California, for instance, NPG&E in Northern California, cold temperatures. So they said, well, I'm going to turn on the heat, not knowing and thinking, okay, maybe my bill will be a little bit more, not knowing that their bill would be categories 2, 3, 4 times higher.
So did the gas companies get concerned about default from the consumer? Like, so if I'm not going to know till the end of the month when I get my gas bill, right?
Right.
I've just doubled or tripled my expending or whatever. That puts the risk back into the gas company, right? Because now I get defaults across if people can pay. Is that something people are worried about?
Absolutely. So those bills, those elevated bills, for instance, the bills in January, so the bills for November went out late December, and those were interesting bills. The bills for December will go out late January, have gone out late January, and those are huge bills. So there's a lot of worry, a lot of concern of how customers are going to be dealing with that. Absolutely. And to be honest, it's also affecting in the marketplace itself. So if I'm a retail marketer selling gas to small CNI, I have a certain portfolio of customers I cover year on year. I see a range of prices between $5 or $6 and maybe on the high side 10 or 12. I kind of know what my working capital needs to be. I know what my credit limits are with my suppliers. Balance of the month, December natural gas traded $90 at one point in December. Okay, so that was buying natural gas for the balance of the month. That was around the 10th or the 11th. I wanted to have a continued flow for the balance of the month. It was $90. It finished up for January trading $50 in me and over 52 in LA in the SoCal territory. These are massive increases. And
Yeah, that's where all the volatility is, and that's why everybody's been looking at um, California. And so, looking forward into the summer, the same issues, is this a supply issue? Because there's plenty of natural gas. What's the issue that prevents or constrains this natural gas going into the California market? Looking out into the summer, can anything be done?
So this is exactly on. So the fact, and as Chris, you were alluding to, you're just getting these bills now. Now suddenly, after the fact, you find out you've got these high prices. So now your behavior is changing a little bit. You also have really interesting, as those bills came out, you had people talking on. I watched some of the social media and the television broadcasts in SoCal, and they're talking about, they were blaming LNG exports for the high natural gas prices they were suffering. And all this LNG going to Europe for the Ukraine situation. And it was kind of curious, okay, people are completely, utterly disconnected because they don't know that natural gas in the Permian, which is like a source for those other pipelines, is trading at $2. It's constrained. They're trying to find any market they can for that gas to get out of that basin and go to a market. So that's not the problem. The problem was not these LNG exports, because, and FYI, there are no LNG terminals even on the Pacific Coast to export the stuff. So what it is really it's a local problem. And so those constraints you saw on pipelines, the low storage, and no new build out kind of sets, you'll be going into the year pretty much where you were. There was one pipeline, El Paso, that had an explosion. They had an issue about 18 months ago in August of, I want to say 21. And that flow should be coming back online. So that should be a little bit of a help. But everything is elevated. Storage, this cost of storage costs for the dealers and suppliers to support the market, especially in for your winter peak demand, it's astronomical. It's more than doubled. So just your storage demand costs, just your rental for that unit to store the gas for the next period is shocked high. So all those costs are from this previous episode are going to be pushed into the future as well.
So what I've heard you talked about, so basically demand reduction in gas isn't really effective because it's delayed response from the consumer, at least at the individual consumer. Maybe for commercial contracts, they probably have a closer eye of what's going on in the commercial pricing. And then supply and infrastructure seems to be tight. But I mean, a lot of people blame the Ukraine war for gas. And there was already a gas problem, I believe, before the war. I mean, volatility was there even beforehand. I think it just exacerbated it for people in some instance. I don't know what the impact is in North America, but this shouldn't come as a surprise, right? So to me, this volatility, I mean, there's demand and infrastructure. And you said, yeah, there was less wind. Okay, so there was some less energy generated by wind. So the forecasting maybe didn't get that right. Why are we in this situation, and how do we get out of it? Because it's the same problem California, I think, had with nuclear. We don't want that in our backyard. We don't want this in our backyard, all that stuff. How do we get there, and how do we solve this problem?
Well, so that's a good point. So they have seen some of these issues, policymakers have, and I'm not big on the power side, other than to say that they've extended some of the permitting or the licensing on one of these nuclear plants that I'm aware of, a couple of years longer because they realized that the runway was a little bit tighter than it should be. But the other interesting thing is that they're really dependent right now on natural gas generation as that bridge fuel when the renewables, and as they take the nukes down and the coal they've eliminated, and the renewables are coming up. Natural gas is that bridge fuel, so you're really pulling on that existing natural gas infrastructure in a way that hasn't been done before, or it hasn't. It's been done before, but now it's being taken to a much higher level of magnitude.
So one of the things that I've talked to on this podcast before, I had GE Turbine Group on here before, and they were talking about stuff they're doing in hydrogen and mixing hydrogen with gas to get more efficiency and a little greener. Is that taking place in California yet, and is that going to make an impact on the market?
I have to look at that. I mean, the big rollout right now is RNG, renewable natural gas. So that there's a renewable natural gas mandate. And within that, the end users and the utilities are looking to procure that. That's really interesting because, like any of these early renewable markets, it's basically a bundled product. I have to buy natural gas, which is renewable, and then transport that to my utility. So I really have to source it locally. And that's the challenge that's going on right now with that versus, say, a rec market where I can produce my renewable natural gas in Nebraska, separate the rec from the natural gas, sell that rec to California. That rec is, only used once. And then, as a nation state, we take advantage of that. That's kind of the deal that they're dealing with. On the hydrogen side, everyone's kind of experimenting. I know in Houston, where I am, CenterPoint has talked about that they think they can get 10% hydrogen into the LDC system safely as the hydrogen gets introduced. But you've also, as it becomes more of a source. But, that's an interesting concept, and Jay had mentioned on the IRA early on, a lot of people are still trying to look at the interpretation because I don't know. I was at a conference recently, and the number of 45Q credits or 45U, 45 this, 45 that. I mean, it's as long as your arm, and they're all looking for interpretation from Treasury and the IRS on how these credits are going to be treated. And until they can do that, developers and and stakeholders can't really make steps. That there's a lot of capital waiting to take advantage of it, but they're not sure how the rules work yet.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, so I talked to a lot of natural gas traders in the last couple of weeks. And so how should people position themselves, Ken, going into the summer? Should they wait to buy natural gas as they get closer to the summer? Or because prices have come down so much on the NYMEX, is it time to inject? How should people view going into the summer, the next 60, 90 days?
That's a really good question. I was just on a call yesterday with another client in the West about that situation. And if you look at what's going on with Henry Hub, the Henry Hub component of it has come down so hard, based on the associated gas flows from all the oil drilling, really successful drilling for natural gas itself in the Haynesville, which is in northern Louisiana. So we're really in a strong natural gas position. We've had a warmer weather, in the continental United States generally. So we're in a strong storage position, and the curve reflects that. So we're telling clients right now, lock in components of that Henry Hub, because that's just risk. What's going to happen, especially if you're an end user utility in California, you just faced $50 prices, for January. If you think Henry Hub's going to come down another 50 cents, okay, so be it. But I'm like, why don't we look at that? Well, let's risk manage and lock in elements of that with our tool set. And we can do a lot of different things around the Henry Hub piece. But then watch eagle-eyed the basis, which is that component difference between Henry Hub and that delivered market, which covers transportation into that delivery, depending on if it's coming from the Rockies, coming from the Permian, or coming from Canada, delivered to those city
So
gates.
just to follow along those lines,
Focus on that basis.
yeah, Ken. So just to follow along those lines, are utilities planning or expecting a catastrophic scenario like blackouts or brownouts at the peak of the California summer?
I haven't heard that yet, but I will say this. We are right now, so the utilities in SoCal, San Diego, San Francisco are all freaking out about this whole bill situation that, Chris alluded to before, these massive costs that consumers are going to be suffering. So there's going to be a repercussion to that. So how they're setting the table professionally is a whole different story.
And so you see this happening now where energy costs are so high for a lot of the people, and a lot of the companies in California, tech especially, have started laying off people. So what's kind of the sentiment going forward? How is it affecting going into the summer?
Well, the interesting thing there, right? So we're talking about the inability to see prices. Well, so when I'm driving around, like I said, I can see gasoline prices. Well, one place I could go to pretty easily is the internet, and I could go to the Cal ISO and I could see their real time or their next day power prices. And if you just use a simple 10 heat rate, which I use a lot of times for kind of a mid-merit kind of 10 times, divide that power price by 10 gets you your gas price. You were seeing $300, $400, power prices. So those are, so if I'm running server farms, if I'm, in the cloud, those electricity costs, it's a double whammy. Not only am I getting hit with high electricity bills, but I'm also getting hit with high natural gas bills. So even though some of these tech companies may not be using a ton of natural gas, except for maybe HVAC and heating kind of base load, they are getting whacked with high power bills as well.
But how are they hedging against that, right? So there's the economy is going good, bad, or indifferent. It depends what you believe. The price is up, so that will probably select demand on manufacturing and others. And if there's layoffs, it's going to be a demand side there, which will kind of ease the market. but how are you recommending your customers protect against this, right? Because the
Sure.
bill's already out there. I've already used the gas, so I can either afford to pay the $300-400 or whatever I owe you, or I can't, right?
Yeah, and that's a done deal. So what we're looking at, if you're on the top, so really the planning right now is for the next season, which starts in April and goes to March. So April 23 through March 24. That's what we're working with our clients right now on. And that's what I was alluding to. The NYMEX curve is pretty flat, been pretty de-risked because of the oversupply component of it. Take that out. We're looking to mitigate the risk on that. And then basis, we're watching that component I was talking about to the city gate from the difference to Henry Hub. Watch that like a hawk. And we're right now, if we're seeing mean reverted values that kind of look like they did in previous years, we're suggesting that they buy that, lock in components of it, and then we'll help risk manage it going on. But the other issue, Chris and Jay, which is non-trivial, is this will be an extinction event for some of the smaller marketers. Okay, they're not going to survive this because they didn't have bank relationships, they didn't have the credit to facilitate this. They can't finance receivables, which normally get paid in 30 to 40 days, let's say, that go out 90, 180, or don't get paid at all. Okay, that's going to be a huge problem.
So is equity or someone stepping in? Is equity or someone stepping into buying that debt right now, or
Right,
buying the risk?
no, you know what? You're way early in the process. We're just going through this first cycle of paying for the December gas. The December gas was only billed on January 25th, Jay. So that was really the first really elevated, time. So now, that as the sausage is getting made, we're working through the system right now.
And so, what about the utilities, the bigger utilities? They can maybe manage price risk and try to plan for the summer. But how are some of these retail energy companies in California? How are they planning? Who maybe don't have the resources for coming up with large hedging
That's
programs?
what
Do you think there'll be some pain there in the retail side?
Yeah, a lot of those companies. It's my opinion only, but I think some of those companies will go away, the smaller ones. So, and if they had lockbox relationships with the majors that supply them, like Shell or BP or similar entities, they may get rolled up into those guys. I'm waiting to see what the after effect here is. But and this is what I was alluding to earlier in terms of working capital. That market just does not have the number of high quality suppliers and dealers that you have in other places. You don't have a lot of producer relationships. So, for instance, if I'm trading in Texas, Permian, Louisiana, I've got the producers have marketing. You can get natural gas. There's a lot of dealer market between the super majors, the Shells, the BPs. The banks are trading, and there's a lot of active. You can look at the NGI tables, league tables, and you see there's a lot of folks. That list in the West is a third to a quarter, and now they're suffering. And we even with our clients who are some of the strongest credit rated entities in the country, were challenged to manage some of these risks and deal with the fact that there was concentration risks for certain dealers, and other dealers just weren't offering products. They weren't selling gas.
So just to pick up on this risk issue, so some of these energy companies that serve the California market also serve other markets. They are national retail energy providers. So is there a spillover effect from this credit risk that might spread to other states? And the follow-up question to that is, how are companies managing this capital settlement credit risk?
That is a really interesting element right there. So another thing that coincided with this event happening started right around Thanksgiving and rolled into December. So you had a bunch of holidays. You had a lot of days where you're buying not gas for 1 day, but 3 days, 4 days because of the way that construct worked. And it was year end. So a lot of these commodity guys, let's say, had pretty decent years. They kind of put their hands, sat on their hands and said, you know what, I'm going fishing. I don't want to affect, I've done pretty well this year. So we saw a lot less liquidity and a lot less activity, especially in December and early November and especially in December, where there just was no market at times, or it was very difficult to get two ways.
So I guess maybe, and I'm still learning the gas market. I'm more on the energy side and the power side. But generation is one of the biggest users of gas in my
Yes.
understanding of gas, right? So if that's the predictable element, I get the individual consumer demand drives that. So how is the impact in California? How much of the power generation is coming from gas turbines today? And how is that impacting, right? Because as you get wind or solar or whatever renewable that you're going to choose to use, is that capacity also impacting softening the market up, or
Oh,
is it just
absolutely. So, like I was describing before, when you had low wind and renewables, natural gas it came in and filled the gap. Well, they're also really interesting. So we're talking about infrastructure. Liso Canyon is an 85 BCF natural gas storage unit in Southern California. They had some problems. They had gas leaks and issues and fires. So they were taken down from 85 BCF down to 37. And then just this year, they got a little bit back up into the low 40s. But still, you lost half of your capacity for storage. You've had PG&E in that San Francisco area, Northern California, trying to get out of the storage business. They don't want to spend any money because they think their customers are going away over time. These are big capital investments, so that's going away. And the reason this fits back to your power is, as a power guy, okay, I'm real time. There's a bunch of ancillary services I can sell against that. If I backstop my ancillary services, which is maybe spinning reserves, ramp up, ramp down, all those sorts of things have to be backstopped by my fuel. If I'm Texas, I could have a coal plant. Okay, I can just pull against my stack if I need to do that. I got no issue. Or I may have a real time or same day gas contract. Well, I've got to do the same thing in California, but I'm pulling on storage to accomplish that task. So now I'm competing with, I just said that we've dramatically reduced the amount of storage available in the entire market, and the natural and that ability to provide peaking services or balancing services when the wind suddenly stops blowing, at 4 in the afternoon. So, but my power need at 4:10 is the same as in the natural gas fired generation ramps up. Someone's going to meet that demand, and they're doing it. They're sucking on storage to do that. So they're competing with that fixed supply of storage, which is very concerning, causing, again, a source of volatility.
And are you seeing any effect? Are utilities or consumers pushing for any decarbonization, or is it mostly, natural gas is the fuel, the backup fuel or the bridge fuel?
That is, California's is California. It's a leader in kind of that sort of that mentality among, from a politics and a policy perspective. So you're seeing that kind of effort at the same time. You've got this disconnect between, and you may see that also with the larger, more affluent tech community that can kind of afford to, manage these risks because it's a cost, but it's not like you're manufacturing glass or steel or something like that where where it is a key input. So they're kind of luxury goods for these guys. And on the other hand, California is getting more and more interesting in the sense because it's a barbell. You've got a lot of affluent people that can afford, to be backstopped on these things, and then you have a lot of other communities which are very energy vulnerable to these price spikes. So without a doubt, I think there's elements of the vulnerable community which is kind of disconnected from this low carbon argument beyond who they elect as politicians. Because they're suffering they're going to be suffering these major bills.
So just looking, yeah. So just looking into the future, if you were to look into your crystal ball, if there was one thing about the California market that you could sort of wish could change, or just wave your magic wand that would alleviate some of this price volatility, what would that be?
Well, there was a project. It was a right-of-way project on existing pipe moving natural gas from Calgary, from Canada down into that area that got pushed back, and that got stopped in Oregon, for instance. So I think they've got to have more coordination on the if you really want a net zero 2050 policy to occur, you're going to have to make sure the transition works, and you have to make sure you can't just simply subsidize that vulnerable side of the barbell with cash payments. You're going to have to make sure the whole thing functions as a system, and you're going to have to make the investments in logistics, transportation, and midstream that support your transition, especially markets which are kind of by definition cleaved off by themselves, right? And by legacy or decisions previously. It's no different from Boston, right? They can't get it. They're in that whole U.S. Northeast, which is locked out of natural gas additions because they've opted not to take gas from the Marcellus Utica, but to import LNG.
So is the market working as designed, or is the policy, as you're alluding to, keeping the market from actually being a free market and doing what it's supposed to do, right? Because price and volatility match supply and demand by definition. That's a market, right? So if you take away supply and you don't add new infrastructure and demand is still there, price is going to be high, right? So there's really no way to hedge that, right? That's just the market doing what markets do. Is that
Absolutely.
accurate?
So, and to your point earlier, when you have this delayed effect on demand, so your demand is kind of inelastic, right? Because your users, except for some of the more sophisticated CNI and your larger users, just aren't seeing the real time price. They're not following the day price to know that what's going on. So that issue has got to get resolved better, to get that pricing signal to the market. But that said, in the professional market, given the constraints I was describing, whether it was transportation, whether it was dealers and liquidity, whether it was all these different things, those price signals had to happen to get people to say, stop, someone's got to stop using gas. Okay. Someone's got to either, shut down what they're doing because it's really, really expensive. And so you've really got a smaller subset of people that are seeing that real price or that.
So just a final question, Ken. So you said, California wants to do the transition as quickly as possible. Do you see natural gas as a better bridge fuel or nuclear? Which one do you think goes away first?
Well, you can't. Yeah. What do you think? I mean, even Germany is looking right at extending some of those licenses in some of these places. They didn't. They said no. They said no, and then found. And you saw
Germany is bringing coal back.
Yeah, exactly. Dancing to coal. Well, that's another issue, and that's why natural gas was so high in the United States earlier this year. Was actually the European use of coal. You're getting back. That's a side item, but coal soared in price so much that we were pulling all that east of the Mississippi coal out of the United States and shipping it to Europe. That drove up the price of coal in the United States. So what happened is normally in the summertime, when you get that, when natural gas gets expensive, you go gas to coal switching. Well, guess what? My coal was suddenly super expensive. Not as economic. I used natural gas instead. And that was kind of the things that set the table for that, Henry Hub trading $9-10 right into the fall before it collapsed.
So it sounds like we've had a good journey. We've heard a little bit about the problems in California, or the volatility. I don't know if it's problems, but the volatility in the market.
Problem is a good comment, and the challenge is that when you set the table, we're in the same place. We've had a marginal improvement on one pipeline that had an outage for 600 MCF a day on El Paso. Everything else is exactly the same as it was. Okay.
And what I heard you say, which is always interesting when we're on a hydrocarbon call, because I get email from fans saying, well, why is it, are you talking about gas? You've done a couple episodes on gas. Why are you talking about that? And even the president, when he did his State of the Union, said, look, this is a transition. Things are going to be here. It's going to take place over time. And what I heard you say is, like, without proper management, we don't get the desired carbon reduction anyway. So, assuming that this is a base load and a technology that we're going to need for business to go and the lifestyles that we've come to live and like and you talked about lower socioeconomic folks needing having the energy security of having gas or an alternative.
Yeah.
It sounds like there either needs to be policy or a conscious decision if we're not going to see these problems regularly into the future. So that's what I'm taking away from this interview is that, you're basically saying, okay, well, next quarter is going to be kind of flat, or the next cycle from March to April, or there's a next window where it's going to be good, but I haven't heard anything that changes this volatility. So it's just predicting when those volatile events take place is kind of what part of your risk management strategy would be.
Yeah, and the thing that's the most worrisome is I can't really argue that this was a one-off, right? You could say, okay, I had this sort of event that drove price. It was a one-off event. It was some sort of, a pipeline exploded completely, and and you had a massive reduction in supply, but that'll get remedied over time. So we don't want to do anything structural because that was a one-off. We'll fix it, and then we'll go back on our merry
Yeah, and
way.
Ken, I have those same thoughts where I feel like policymakers think, oh, we made it okay. We somehow scraped through this winter. And so it's an incentive to continue doing the same things. And if you look at what happened in Germany, they brought back more coal.
Yeah.
New England brought back more oil. At the peak, New England grid was more brown than it was green. And they made it through the winter. And Germany and Europe spent $500 billion on subsidies and high prices. They made it through the winter. And my fear is that policymakers shouldn't take that thinking that, oh, that was what solved the problem rather than mild weather.
Yeah, it was a mild winter.
I can't disagree or agree with you more. I mean, when you talk about New England, their renewable stack at times was trash and wood pellets. Those were those were leaders when when the wind dropped off. So, these are really curious, sources of energy, which are effectively from these policy decisions. But I do see that the challenge is we've got you've had high natural gas prices in Boston for years, right? Without a doubt. And the policies haven't changed. They have not.
But it's a supply problem for the most part, right?
Yeah,
And New England's always been a supply. Nobody wants a new pipeline going into New England. At least that's my understanding of the problem statement, or part of it.
Absolutely. So that they haven't changed that. You've got the same situation in the West. So how do I fix that? It seems like it's the same sort of policy mentality. So I'm not optimistic about massive policy changes except on the margin. So maybe I extend that license on that nuclear plant, but I still have to have power. So,
yeah, but you get floating wind and you get other things that are changing the game as well, right? So New England's got access to wind, right? So there's new alternatives being added all the time.
But here's the really interesting balance. So I look at Texas, we're 25, 30% renewables right now. Well, what we've done, right, so we've taken that intermittent stack and increased it. And FYI, I did 8 PPAs for wind farms in my last role. Basically enabled these renewable, these big utility scale renewable deals, to produce power for 10, 15, 30 years to get off the ground, get their funding, and get built. So I understand that market. But as you push out, the units can easily dispatch and are reliable, and you take on the intermittency until we really have a very robust battery regime, you're going to be super, super dependent on natural gas and in a whole different, whole set of different kind of power generation units when combined cycle, simple cycle, to basically come on and fill that gap when the intermittency drops down and that battery stops dispatching. So that's the issue. That's really the issue. So nat gas is not going away. And if you really want a robust renewable transition, with renewables being a big piece, either my battery technology has got to get accelerated massively now, or I add natural gas. And FYI, they're going to more. They have an electric car mandate. We haven't even talked about that. So here, and they're using even more electricity, right, which is going to put even more pressure on the grid. So, yes, I'm going to be adding renewables, but unless I also add the other components of it that make those renewables more reliable, I'm going to be even more dependent on natural gas, and I'm not adding any natural gas infrastructure.
Yeah. And you mentioned a little bit about technology, and that's something we plan to explore in this podcast mini series a little bit more. What are the technologies that are on the horizon that could supplement electricity, natural gas usage going into the future?
Yeah, I think those are going to be great questions. I was just at an energy conference, I was saying 2 weeks ago, which was completely focused on the new energy futures and what those technologies would look like. A lot of them, like I said, the folks are, they're waiting to see what the subsidies look like and how those are going to be interpreted. So what makes some of those investment decisions around the IRA? I know there's been a breakthrough on, or there was a news article on an iron-based utility scale battery that might be more interesting.
Yeah, iron flow batteries are nice. Yeah.
So maybe that'll take a little bit of pressure off the the lithium ion ones. They're all competing in the same thing on cars and different places. But without a doubt, there's components of fossil fuels that are going to have to be there to extend this time. And we're a first world country to be having these sorts of things. It's kind of astounding. We kind of knew this could potentially happen, and we haven't taken the measures to deal with it. That's where it's going to be a very interesting world going forward, because as the developing world says, okay, I can do some of this stuff, or I can rely on oil and gas, which I know is going to get there. There's some interesting value propositions for, folks that have kind of a different mentality or have a different strategy, let's call it.
Well, Ken, it's been an amazing interview. I thank you so much for spending time with us and our audience. It's been enlightening to me. I think I know a little bit more about California, enough to be dangerous, I would say. And it's not the rosiest picture we end with, but if you don't understand the elements, it's hard to get something to change or get fixed. So I think it's been enlightening to understand a bit better. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Well, and like I said before, they're just cleaning up the China right now. So some of the questions you're asking, we'll find out later. We'll see what cups were broken and what stuff they could glue back together. So kind of setting the table. But, my job really is to work with these clients, help them understand what is happening, why it happened, and what we can do. So, that's my critical role. But thanks so much for the opportunity, guys.
Thank you. And for our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this content as much as we have. If you do like this content, please share it, subscribe to it, look for us on YouTube, and we'll talk to you again in another episode of Insider's Guide to Energy. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.